And for this panel, Modeling Gender on Wikidata, I will leave the floor to our moderator, John Samuel, who's going to introduce us to the topic and the speakers.
Thanks, Leah, for starting this initiative for the Wikidata Data Modeling Days 2023. I'm John Samuel, and I'm associate professor in CP Lyon in Lyon, France, and I'm also an active contributor on Wikidata and Wikimedia Commons. I also work on the Wikidata Wiki project LGBT plus. And I'm very happy to introduce to you a very rich panel of speakers from different parts of the world working on the topic of gender in their research works and in their studies. Just I will start with a brief outline of our session. The first part, there are three parts of this session. The first part will be done by Beatrice and Daniel, who will be talking about the current model of gender and main issues on Wikidata. The second part will be done by Crystal and Ariel, who will be talking about the methodologies and policies for improvement, these issues that will be talked previously. And finally, we have Katie Whittington, who had given a keynote talk during the Wikidata workshop this year. We'll be talking about how to make, what are the challenges making these queer data properties inclusive. And finally, the floor is up to the audience. If you have questions, if you have any doubts about the discussions that we have raised here, you can ask us during this time. So I let all the speakers introduce themselves. So I start with Ariel. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Ariel Rodriguez. I'm a current humanities and interdisciplinary studies librarian at the University of Puget Sound, and came to Wikidata through a capstone project that was sponsored by Crystal when I was doing my MLIS at the University of Washington.
Yeah, please.
Hi everyone, I am Beatrice. I am a PhD student in artificial intelligence at University of Pisa and Gran Sasso Science Institute, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm here with my colleague Daniele Metilli to present the current model of gender in Wikidata from the results of our study called Wikidata Gender Diversity. Thank you.
You, Beatrice. Crystal.
Hi, I'm Crystal Uragi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a science cataloger and linked data enthusiast at the University of Washington Libraries in Seattle. My wiki username is clements.uwlib, and I am a member of the LD4 Wikidata Affinity Group and a participant in Wiki Project Personal Pronouns. I was a participant in the PCC Wikidata Pilot Project and the LD4 Ethics and Linked Data Affinity Group, and I'm currently co-chairing the PCC Identity Management Advisory Committee. And I've been really lucky to work with Ariel Rodriguez and Alex Young and Claire Cronk on gender and Wikidata over the past couple of years, and I'm really excited to participate in this panel with colleagues whose work I respect very much.
Thank you, Crystal. Daniele.
Yes, thank you. I'm Daniele Metilli. My pronouns are they, them. And I work as a research fellow at University College London. And I'm part of the Wikidata Gender Diversity Project together with Beatrice, Chiara, and Marta. Now I want to mention that Chiara and Marta are not here today, but they have contributed, so they are listed in the list of authors. But the presentation of our part will be done by me and Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Wethington. I'm a fourth year PhD student at the CU Boulder Info Science Department. I'm maybe not as involved in Wikidata as everyone else on the panel, but really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. So over to you, Beatrice and Daniele, for the first part.
Okay, I will start and then Beatrice will do the second part. So, first of all, when we talk about gender in Wikidata, we have to start from P21, which is the property that connects a person, or not just a person actually, to a gender identity. But as we can see here in the images, of course, the property is called sex or gender. And in the example, there is a person called Joy, who is non-binary. So it seems quite simple by looking at it this way, but we can see in the next slide that things get very complicated. This list of terms and concepts was done by Crystal and Ariel. Thank you. We have moved it here because it is very important to define what we're talking about. So sex is a label assigned to a person at birth based on physical characteristics. So it's something that is assigned. Gender is a social construct, very complex social construct, encompassing a lot of things. Gender identity is how the individual people see themselves, right? And then there is a concept of gender modality, which is newer than the others, but we very much believe in this concept that tells us how or if a person's gender identity corresponds to the gender identity they were assigned at birth. So it can be, for example, transgender or cisgender. Next slide, please. Yes, so basically the main problem with the current P21 definition is that it is called sex or gender. And it is ambiguous because it is unclear what it refers to. So which of these aspects that have been defined in the previous slide are represented by P21? Is it about sex? Is it about gender? Is it about gender modality? Is it about gender identity? Or is it about something different? So if we look at this definition that is given in the description of the property, it says, for example, sex or gender identity of human or animal. For human, male, female, non-binary, a list of possible values. And then it says to use, okay, just for what to use for groups. But basically, it has also several alternative labels here, or aliases. So biological sex, gender or sex, gender identity, gender expression. This gets very confusing when we have all these concepts all jumbled together into a single property, right? So for the users, it can be difficult to understand what it is exactly. Then can you move to? Okay, there is also an animation here because. So what I wrote here is the listed values in the description of the property differ based on language. So depending on the description on the language depending on the language the description is visualized in, the description of the property changes and the list of allowed values changes. If we check the talk page below in the light blue part of the slide, we see that actually there are many more values that are allowed. So it is confusing also just by looking here, right? So next slide, please. So which are the allowed values? And these are organized into a quite complex taxonomy. And there is a taxonomy for sex, and there is a taxonomy for gender identities. And this is a taxonomy for sex, where it is organized quite based on biological concepts, but then it goes down to women and men, which are actually terms more related to gender than sex, because sex would be female and male. And it is interesting to note that none of these are allowed values of P21. So these are not the female or male that are used with P21, these are two different values that, or let's say items that are not used. The only one in this picture that is actually allowed as a value of P21 is intersex, which is an important value, which is used on not so many people, but it is good to have. Then there is next. Okay. Now this was actually changed quite recently because we have been using the images from our initial study, but we have found out that the model is changing a lot as we go along, and so. For example, intersex is no longer a subclass of anything, so it is disconnected from everything else. And then there is also this subclass that was a subclass of intersex, which is now considered a derogatory term. So it is not used, luckily, but it is now a subclass of organisms. So we wanted to show here that the model is in constant flux, and this is also a problem because it is difficult to study and also difficult to understand sometimes for the users. Next slide, please. Then if we go to the taxonomy of gender, this is actually the more interesting part because here we have the gender identities. And this was the situation 1 year ago. But there have been here also significant changes. But the main thing that we can see is that there is a distinction between on the left gender and on the right gendered, which are two confusingly similar concepts. The values below are all allowed values of P21, but next animation, please. Gender was defined initially as characteristics distinguishing between femininity and masculinity, so defined in a binary way, and then it was changed more recently to social concept which distinguish, there is a typo here in Wikidata actually, the different gender categories. So it was made more vague. And gendered is the state of having gender identity, which is the opposite of agender, which is also probably not necessarily correct. But on the left, we have all these gender identities that are, for example, transgender person, non-binary, but also we have third gender and we have gender queer. And on the right, we have female and male. So it is quite unclear why they are separated this way, since these female and male are not related to sex, but they are still under identity. Can you move to the, okay. Now there have been recent changes, so a lot of changes. First of all, transgender person is now named transgender, and this is a subclass of gender modality, which is a good change. Gender queer is now a subclass of non-binary, which is debatable. Transgender female and transgender male have been changed to respectively trans woman and trans man, which is very good. And the last one is cisgender woman and cisgender man have replaced cisgender female and cisgender male, which is also good in my opinion. So there has been some progress that has been driven by the users. Also, yeah, there is one small change there. Next slide, please. And then we have a big non-binary umbrella with everything behind it, below it, more specific identities. But as you can see, it is very complex. This part is quite stable, where we have all the non-binary terms. But it is important to note that not everyone who identifies, for example, as agender, bigender, and one of these actually wants to be identified as non-binary. So depending on how the taxonomy is organized, this can be good or bad, and not everyone can agree. So next, Beatrice will talk about, again, P21. Beatrice?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about more inconsistencies of P21. As we saw now with Dani, the title of the property sex or gender presents possible ambiguities, just because, as Daniele said, associating two different concepts with a single data expression can create problems when it comes to stating the value of that piece of information. And this confusion is also evidenced by the labels, descriptions, and aliases in other languages. In the case of the description in English, for example, it is made clear that for persons it is possible to assign a value such as male, female, non-binary, intersex, transgender female, transgender male, and agender. And in this list, we can see that there is like a mix of expressions that on one hand are exclusively attributable to the spectrum of sex assigned at birth, for example, female or intersex, and on the other hand, expressions that are totally independent of sex and instead concern only gender identity, for example, the term non-binary. And unlike the English one, other descriptions, the other slide, the previous one, yeah, thank you. Other descriptions do not report possible non-binary values in any way. For example, the description in Italian states that for persons must be male, female, or intersex, and for animals, male or female. So we can see that we cannot see all of the descriptions now, but we can say that the inconsistency between the different languages is an important issue that should be addressed. And then a final point that is useful to complete this analysis is that concerning aliases, which are defined in the data structures as alternative names. But users that are unfamiliar with these topics and issues might think that the list of aliases is nothing more than like a series of synonyms, all expressing the same concepts. So the fact that in cases like the English languages or the Spanish language, sorry, people, I'm still in the previous slide, sorry. I can say to you when you can move on. So the fact that in case like the English language or the Spanish language, people might mistakenly believe that talking about sex and talking about gender identity could be the same thing, when in fact this is not true. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide now. In our study, a number of properties on Wikidata were examined in order to collect all those that convey either implicitly or explicitly an information related to people's gender or sex. So even if these properties do not have as their main purpose the expression of information about gender, they may implicitly inform about the sex of gender of a person. And this fact actually confirms that it is important to construct a consistent ontological model that is inclusive in its totality, and precisely because certain properties can also be involved in this discourse. And these include properties concerning, for example, family relationships, occupations, linguistic and grammatical aspects, or even identifiers such as those related to the world of sport, for example. And in our opinion, this network of properties highlights and underscores in some way the need to establish a comprehensive and inclusive ontological model in all its aspects and levels. Okay, so we can move on to the next one. This is actually a collection of screens that aims to underscore that there is issues behind references when it comes to sex and gender data. And each of these methods can pose a risk because, as we see, there are cases where the data is, for example, inferred from Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is not necessarily reliable on this information. Also, inferring the data from the given name is also very problematic because we all know that there are personal names that can have different genders across cultures and languages, and this can lead to potential misidentification. And the same also applies to inference from the patronymic, for example, which cannot assure us that the gender data is true, is real. And finally, we can say also that this is important, and this is problematic when the gender data is imported from external databases, as in the case from BF, sorry, which contains errors in this respect. So we can move on to the next one. We have just a little part to talk about the data, because in this pie chart, you can see then that firstly, trans men have been included in the men category, while trans women have been included in the women category. And we can see the gap between men that are more included in the knowledge base, and then women who suffer from a quite noticeable underrepresentation. But what is important for us to study is also the representation of genders outside the mere binary distinction, which is why this graph also wanted to highlight a severe underrepresentation of trans people, intersex people, and non-binary people, especially when we compare these numbers with real-world statistics. So the problem of underrepresentation is added to those related to model that we are discussing today. In the next slide, we have summarized all the issues. So this is a series of problems that can be addressed today, and we decided to collect them in a list to facilitate our discussion. So we can talk about the naming, personal pronouns, edit words and vandalism, language inconsistencies, underrepresentation, model volatility, gender personal names, inadequate page protections, difficulty to report errors, and gender occupation, but the list is open, so it is not exhaustive at all. To the final slide, there is our contacts, mine and Daniele's one, and also the contacts of our colleagues Chiara and Marta, and the QR code to see our website, Wikidata. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Crystal Uragi again, and I'm going to start the second half of the presentation, and then Ariel Rodriguez is going to continue and talk about policy. I'm going to talk about some improvements that the Wikidata community could make to address some of the problems my colleagues have described. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So as we saw, P21 conflates distinct characteristics of distinct classes of entities. And to remedy this, I think that it's necessary to create a new property for the recording of sex of non-human organisms only, to stop recording sex for humans, and to improve our methodologies for recording gender information for human beings. Next slide. A new data model should replace P21 with new properties for gender identity and gender modality as distinct characteristics. Next slide, please. The community should establish a shared approach for respecting people's privacy and prioritizing their safety and well-being. A simple answer to this is to avoid including gender information on Wikidata at all. I don't believe that this approach will be adopted. If we continue to describe gender information on Wikidata, I think a paradigm shift is needed. Editors must start to value accuracy over completeness. Default values for gender properties should be something indicating that the information is not available or has not been disclosed. And the community should also consider a notability requirement for this information. Next slide, please. The Wikidata community's approach to recording gender information should shift to a slow is best mentality. To prioritize data accuracy and reduce harm to individuals through misgendering or outing, restrictions should be put in place to block bots from editing gender properties and to limit batch editing activity. References adhering to clearly defined standards should be required. Next slide, please. When making statements about gender, editors should be encouraged to ask questions first rather than editing hastily and expecting others to verify or correct any incorrect statements later. Standards for references for gender information for living people should be active, public, recent self-identification. The community should discuss the possibility of relaxing this requirement for deceased persons. Next slide, please. Common references currently used for P21, including inferences based on given names or personal pronouns, or imports from statements made on Wikipedia, are unacceptable as references. Next slide, please. The current metadata ecosystem surrounding sex and gender in Wikidata is messy, often inaccurate, and sometimes harmful. The data model for gender evolved haphazardly and is not the product of thoughtful design. This is important, and I think the Wikidata community is up to the challenge of implementing a clean, accurate data model to replace this P21 mess. Next slide, please. Many volunteers will need to work together to undertake a careful metadata remediation process. I've included a rough set of steps for such a process on this slide, which could involve removing all sex and gender statements from non-human entities and replacing them with a new property for sex where appropriate, removing sex and gender statements for human beings that don't include references or with references which do not meet requirements, evaluating further sex and gender statements for human beings, separating gender identities and modalities and replacing statements retaining references, and checking existing references against best practices. Once all of the P21 properties have been cleaned up, I think it makes sense to remove P21 from Wikidata. Next slide, please. Wikidata editors need a set of best practices to guide their expression of gender information in Wikidata. This kind of documentation can set standards for reference requirements, specify that editors should not include a person's gender identity or modality from an earlier phase in their life, and can express logic models to guide decision making in this sensitive area. Next slide, please. Best practices will need to be constantly evaluated and updated by a community of Wikidata editors. Because there are unfortunately people in the world who think other people's genders are up for debate, and the world is not always a safe place for people of all genders, it is essential that Wikimedia policies strongly support best practices. And I'll turn it over to Ariel, who will talk more about policy.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, my name is Ariel. I'm gonna talk about some policies that I came across in working on this. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just, I think, a lot of pertinent policies that probably could use some work. And yeah, so in this slide, I included the Wikidata policies that pertain to privacy and consent of individuals. So this will be the notability and the consent of living people policy. For Wikidata item to be notable, it must fulfill at least one of the two stated goals: to centralize language links across Wikimedia projects or serve as a general knowledge base for the world at large. In addition to meeting one of the goals, it must also have a valid site link to a page on one of the above wiki projects, refer to an instance of a clearly identifiable conceptual or material entity that can be described using serious and publicly available source references, and it fulfills a structural need. The policy concerning living people clearly states that Wikidata strives to provide information whose veracity there is a high confidence in, and not violating a person's reasonable expectation of privacy. Gender-related information, in my view, seems to toe this line between public and private information. It seems public because we often infer it based on our own social cultural norms about gender and our own perceptions of people. And it's private because it's information about a person that is personal to that individual in question. To me, these thresholds seem too lax and inconsistent and can allow for erroneous inferences based on differing sociocultural understandings of gender and can cause harm to the individual in question. Next slide. To Wikidata's own admission, P21 is a property that may violate the privacy of living people, and yet there is no requirement for references for P21 values. Most Wikidata items do require a reference, but there are exceptions to this rule, such as when the value is common knowledge, it refers to an external source of information, or when the item is a source for the statement. In this framework, again, gender related information seems to exist in this space of being common or public knowledge because people often have perceptions of other people's gender. But it could also be the case that the person who has a Wikidata item created about them may never disclose this information, which renders its inclusion as a violation of the policies regarding notability and the consent of living people. Wikidata does have criteria for what counts as a verifiable source, and I have them referenced in the slide, including a promising inclusion for self-published sources. While these are often discouraged, especially if they're being used to write about other people, they can be used if someone is writing about themselves. Next slide. These are just some inconsistencies and recommendations that might be useful to mitigate harm caused by the inclusion of gender related information in Wikidata items. These are not exhaustive, obviously, and very much would like some feedback or any sort of criticisms of these thoughts that I've had about this. Regarding the notability and consent of living people policies, I do believe that the thresholds are too lax and they leave too much room for interpretation about what could be considered widespread public knowledge. So there might need to be some more definitional work about what is widespread public knowledge. There's also as was mentioned before, there's some issues and difficulties with getting this item, getting information edited, but more specifically, getting it removed. There seem to be a lot of barriers to getting it actually removed from Wikidata. The issues presented by this can be mitigated, though, I think, by requiring references. I think that references should be required for all gender-related information. The notability policy, in my reading of it, seems to necessitate it. And we should probably narrow the types of sources to those that are explicitly either self-published or contain publicly stated information by the individual. They should also be up to date. They should never include a point in time or backdated reference. So we shouldn't be saying that this person identified as this gender from particular years and then a different one, right? It should be current and in real time. We should also allow for easier self-modification. And then consensus is a really sticky policy that that I don't really have a great answer to. But I think that we should establish a new decision-making criteria that centers harm reduction and should adopt some model like that. And so I'll move over to Katie now.
Thanks. Thanks, Ariel and Crystal. I think the topic on self-modification will come back during the discussion session. And I think it will be very interesting to see the point of view from the community. Thanks again. Katie, it's up to you.
Hi, all. I find it interesting that we just ended on consensus because that's kind of the big point of my my whole section, right? So if we take everything that's been presented so far, we have some really robust ways of improving how gender would be modeled on Wikidata, right? But the way that these changes would actually get implemented within the policies of Wikidata would be through this idea of achieving consensus, right? Which requires going beyond like the people just here and bringing in viewpoints from like potentially any contributors who are interested in gender, one way or the other. But for the quick definition of consensus, it's saying that like all opposing points of discussion should be addressed, but then a single reasonable opposing voice may block achieving consensus. Um, Now, on Wikidata itself, consensus is like rarely defined. There's not um, like a clear numerical threshold for what would constitute achieving consensus as far as in a bigger discussion where there's a lot more people, it may be unreasonable to try and adequately address every single point of opposition to a change. Um, but there's no definition for, say, needing to reach 51% consensus or 80% consensus, right? And indeed, the only place on Wikidata that I could find where consensus was like explicitly defined was in the page for proposing new properties, right? But then throughout the entirety of Wikidata, you'll often see things marked with like consensus not reached, consensus not reached. So obviously, this goal of reaching consensus is like a major challenge for us to make these changes that would be significantly more inclusive for other for marginalized gender data subjects and improving the modeling of gender, right? Next slide, please. So one of the side effects of consensus is that if there's a small minority of people in a discussion who are very vocal and disagree with the decision, you can't really declare consensus. And for larger structural changes, especially ones that would involve making larger policy changes, as we've discussed here, it'll be very hard to say that consensus was reached, right? If there's even a very small minority who are very, very adamant that they don't want these changes implemented for whatever reason, right? Based on the rule that I've found as it is written on paper, right? You could have 1,000 people saying we need to change this, and then one person is a reasonable dissenter, and we can't make any improvements, right? And then we can also see how like a small ideologically aligned block of contributors can stall debates and discourses, right? You raise some random argument, and then in the time that it takes for other people to counter that argument, you've come up with another question, and you've turned something that would probably be rubber stamped into like a several weeks long, if not months long. And based off of the data that I saw in the discussion post for P21, over like the history of the property, like these people can effectively block changes for years at a time, right? And that's why, to a lot of degrees, we still have sex or gender as one property, right? There were proposals for splitting it into leaving P21 as sex and making a new gender identity property. But, consensus was used as a tool to block that new gender identity property from being made, right? By people who may not have had the best of intentions. More on that in a second. But it's also worth noting that if you're a trans contributor, if you're an ally who's very invested in trans people's representation, it's easy to face a lot of emotional fatigue, and there's definitely a higher emotional labor cost for refuting oppositional views. And this leads to a level of attrition amongst contributors who are trying to make more inclusive gender properties. And because they attrition more, this group of people loses their voice over time and loses steam, and it lets the opposition create like this illusion of consensus, right? Next slide, please. And I think this is all manageable in cases where we can assume that all contributors are acting from like a very uh, well-meaning place. But I think it is safe to say that that's not always the case, and it's especially not the case in areas where people's identities are at stake, especially queer identities. These are considered highly politicized, especially now in the last like 2 years in America, at least. And um, our work has found that in a lot of discussion posts, like over again the course of like 10 years of posts, there were a lot of contributors who expressed very blatant homophobic and transphobic sentiments in their discussions, and these were especially pervasive whenever um, proposals were made to improve gender modeling, or even have gender be modeled at all. There were many people who said that gender identity is a mental illness and it shouldn't be modeled, and we should only model biological sex, right? um, but these are, when raised in a discussion, because of our consensus model, we can't just ignore them. We have to refute them, right? We can't assume that someone is clearly acting in bad faith or bias and should be ignored. And this is especially compounded um, because Wikidata is a database, right? On Wikipedia, if we were having this discussion, the only thing that people would be able to like use in order to say a change shouldn't be made is that it would be um, you know, something to do with their ideological beliefs about trans people, right? But because there's this database aspect, it's very easy for someone to say that gender inclusive change would make modeling more cumbersome or less efficient, or in some other way affect the database uh, quality, right? And it can be a lot harder to like parse through, like, would this actually be an issue with the database? Is this an efficiency that we're willing to lose in order to improve inclusion of queer subjects? Um, right. But when those arguments are made in bad faith, it can be very hard to actually understand, well, is there a trade-off that we're willing to have here? Or is this just someone using the idea that like, oh, maybe it would be less efficient in order to stall like more inclusive measures being taken, right? And I believe it's written on Wikidata, and if not, it's like such a big norm. But nobody wants to call out someone who's like a bad faith actor or is clearly exhibiting bias in conjunction with some other argument. So as I said earlier, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to fully like ignore bad faith argumenters and still be able to say that we reached consensus. There's not that much of a mechanism for these questionable opponents, I suppose. Especially if they're appealing to something that is potentially technically true about the database, even if that is a trade-off that like should be made. I think it's fair to say that maybe we can sacrifice efficiency if it means that like trans people aren't being misgendered consistently on their entries, right? But yeah, so next slide, please. Right. So, and it's hard to think of ways to sort of alleviate this problem with consensus, because we can point to measures that can be taken, right? I have a few here. A lot of them are, let's say, like opposed to, I think, some of the core values of Wikidata, unfortunately, right? you could have stronger top-down mandates from like admin levels or moderators or whatever that would bypass consensus, in the sense where, like, if you had someone with more centralized authority than Wikidata really likes to use, say, no, we are splitting sex and gender, or we're only modeling gender, right? And taking a really hard stance and forcing that to be implemented. That's like one way to avoid this like consensus pitfall, right? Another is to like make it a lot more norm, like from a norm perspective, allow discussions to just disregard bad faith actors and biased actors when they can be identified as such. Um, and then also changing the definition of consensus in a way where there's a more clear metric for what can be considered reaching consensus, right? Um, in most consensus-based algorithms of like distributed computing, you know, the barrier is like 50% plus one, and maybe that's too lax for Wikidata, but even picking any sort of numerical way of quantifying whether consensus has been reached, I think would really help streamline, and I think keeping track of like how many people support a change versus how many voices are opposing it, would help dispel this sort of illusion of consensus, or make it very clear that consensus has been reached except for this small other party. But again, these are all solutions that go against the very, I guess, core philosophies of the Wikimedia project, as far as like collaboration and a very like flat hierarchy of you know, editing power. And I think that's where the problem becomes a little bit intractable because it's sort of going, do we want to protect like the identities of queer people, or do we want to protect like the beliefs that Wikidata is sort of built around and founded on? And I know personally where I would want it to go, but I know that that's also like, you know, not necessarily going to be like well accepted by everybody in the Wikidata community. So yeah.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
We have some questions from the public. So I think thank you very much for the presentation on the consensus part, and I think this has also made us think about what exactly is consensus. I have seen some questions from the public, and I also see uh, Hannah who has raised her hand. Hannah, is it? Do you have a question?
No, sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay, fine.
I'm
So,
sorry.
I just move on to the next slide. I have suggested some ideas about this discussion, because sometimes we ask, do we really need to document this information? There was a similar comment from the public. Uh, do we need to document gender information or maybe other sensitive information? So, what is your take on this? This goes to any of the members. And for the public, if you have any other reflections, please see this, some of the ideas, and I will go through some of the questions. Leah, if you please interrupt me if I take more time. So, do we need to document gender information? What do you think? Yeah. So, Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you. We don't necessarily. What we need to do is to treat gender as any other protected characteristic, such as sexual orientation and ethnicity. And at the moment, it is treated very, very differently in Wikidata. And I don't understand why, since it is the same thing, it is the exact same thing. So we need to make sure that of course, I think if we try to remove it, there would be opposition, because people would say legitimately that we would be removing good information and in some cases true information, that maybe it is useful to have also just to have statistics or do studies about even about representation and how many people with a certain identity are represented or not. So I don't think it is. So the question that I think we should ask is not does it make sense to keep or remove this piece of data, but it should be given the current state of Wikidata and given the prevalent attitude of the community to not delete good data, right? What is the best way to go forward? And in my view, Crystal and Ariel's proposals are very, very good proposals, and our project will support them as well. So if there is a request for comment and we can work on it together, maybe we will definitely support it. Also, Kathy's presentation on consensus was very interesting and a lot of food for thought.
Thanks, Danny. This second idea, the question for self-modifications. So there's a comment from Lucy Murray saying adding references for gender is really important. And I think that one of the points that Ariel raised, that we should also allow the way to add the most recent update from the persons in themselves. So what do you think, Ariel? What's your point on self-modifications, since it looks a bit contradictory from the wiki perspective?
Yeah, I think we should allow for self modifications. And I was actually just following up on this question in the chat, that someone delete a statement. I looked into this, and deleting information completely from Wikidata is actually very difficult for people to have done. Usually the outcome that happens is it's just hidden from public view, but then it remains in the database, but it can only be seen by certain sets of users. Um, so I think the self modification bit is very important, and I also think we need to make it easier for this information to be removed if people want it removed.
So go ahead, please.
I see some talk in the chat about some like reasonable reasons why gender information might be useful to include in Wikidata, including generating text in languages that depend on gender to create grammatically correct descriptions of people, or the need to do research on gender representation, like the Women in Red project. And I think that these recommendations are an attempt to balance those legitimate needs with the harms that can come from misgendering or outing people, which are, I think, more important than those needs. The need to not out someone as trans, for instance, where that's not a safe thing to be. Um, that's way more important than needing to, have a grammatically correct statement generated for them. Um, so I think that it's the idea of balancing human beings and their needs against these sort of research and database desires that we have.
Yeah, it's thanks. Ariel, can you go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with what Chris was saying. I really do think adopting a harm reduction approach in this work is really key, because these are real people, right, that might experience some sort of physical or psychological or both forms of harm, right? And we should try to mitigate that as much as possible.
Totally agree with that, especially when it comes to safety of the people, and we have adopted the very strict policies to the sexual orientation. I think this should be the case for gender as well. I would like to ask one more question from Peter. I think Ariel, it's when you were talking about when you were passing through your slides, Peter but had asked, how is this different from the policies for living people in English Wikipedia?
Um, I think that I think somebody followed up on this, but to me it seems like the Wikidata policy is much more loose than the Wikipedia policy. This idea of fulfilling a structural need is a really vague concept that can be used to create Wikidata items about people that might not necessarily fulfill a structural need. I think the Wikidata policy is much more open to interpretation and has very little consequence for when people's privacy is violated. And there's no real enforcement mechanisms that I was able to find that it doesn't really have any teeth to it, I guess, is what I want to say.
Thanks. I think I would. There is one more comment from Jerry Odell. So I think this is more for Katie, and it's interesting because it says there is maybe no consensus on the meaning of consensus. And another point which was raised by Jen and Ellie, being vocal does not mean being reasonable, or is not equal to being reasonable. Katie, what do you think?
Um, I think those are all very true statements, right? If we look at the macrocosm of like our society that we live in, oftentimes the most vocal people are the least reasonable, and there's not much reason to expect that like that macrocosm isn't to some degree reflected in Wikidata, right? Like, uh, data replicates the society that it comes from. And with regards to the no consensus on consensus, I I think it's weird because there almost is a consensus, but it's never articulated and it's never written down. But somehow every time consensus is brought up, it kind of everyone kind of understands like what it's supposed to mean. But it's like everyone in their own mind thinks that everyone knows what consensus is, and it's exactly how they personally think about it. But it's just not very explicit elsewhere.
There are a lot of questions. I think if Leah stops me, I will stop. But I'll take the one more question from Frederick Julia, which he's asking. They're asking, making abstraction of the issues with P21. What is your opinion on consulting the person and documenting this consultation as a reference? For example, we could directly contact the person concerned and ask them, and we could note it down that this information comes validated as information is validated with the persons themselves. What do you think?
There was actually a lot of back and forth answers in the chat, which I attempted to assemble together uh, in the notes document. But I don't know if Crystal or Ariel or someone else want to react to this topic.
I can. I think directly asking a person could be a good idea in different scenarios. I think because the policy states that it has to that it's strange because P21 doesn't require references, so maybe in the interim of not requiring references, having personal contact with a person could be used. But then there's a lot of inconsistency, right? Because then there's also this idea that it needs to be the public in some form, right? I think it could be a good like supplement when asking a person. And I think the key here is this is how is getting correct how they want to be represented and what information about them they want in Wikidata and how they want it in Wikidata, right? I'll pass to Crystal.
Mm-hmm. And just for clarity, I don't reach out specifically to any person saying I'm wanting to documenting just your gender. I usually do this as part of consulting people before stating their belonging to an indigenous people, which is something that I more regularly do. But as I reach out, for example, with someone who based on their biographic information seems to be identifying as a cis female person, this person may actually want to have their gender information be properly represented because of how nouns are either female or masculine form in Wikidata in French, sorry, and therefore in their description as well.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up for today. I wanted to say a big thanks to all the speakers who've been formulating the issues, but also providing some topics for reflection and possible next steps. I think we will all go take away from this session like a lot of questions that we may never have thought about before. So thank you very much. John, do you have some last words before we conclude?
I'd like to say this is really our thoughts on gender is evolving every day. So what we used to think like some years before is not what we think today. We are understanding a lot of things from different cultures. Some years ago, we're not talking about two-spirited gender and other genders in different cultures, as one of the slides was pointing out. We're learning that, and we have to. I agree that from the point of view from Katie, our data we are not so databases are not are made for us. We are not made for the databases. We should not say that, oh, it doesn't work, the database do not work, so we cannot add this information. So we have to consider these aspects when we model gender, that the gender aspect is evolving, and we are as a humans are evolving. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.